Most people look at an Australian mountain and see a mountain. They are wrong about that in a way that takes about 600 million years to properly explain. What geologists have actually found when they looked closely at Australia's ranges, its monoliths, its ancient plateaus, is that every single one of them is a remnant, the exposed, eroded, deeply buried root of something so enormous that if it still existed today, it would rank among the most dramatic mountain landscapes on the planet. The story of what happened to the rest of it is one of the longest and strangest in Earth's entire geological history. What a mountain actually is. Most people have a working idea of what mountains are. They rise dramatically from the surrounding landscape. They have snow on them, or at least the strong suggestion that snow would be reasonable. They are the result of enormous tectonic forces pushing sections of the Earth's crust upward against each other in slow-motion collisions that last millions of years, folding and thickening the rock until it has nowhere left to go but up. The Himalayas are the version of this most people picture first. India, after drifting north across the ancient Tethys Ocean for tens of millions of years, collided with the Eurasian plate roughly 50 million years ago with a force so sustained and so immense that the resulting crumple zone produced the tallest mountain chain on Earth. Mount Everest is still technically rising at a measurable rate today. The collision has not finished. The forces generating it are still active. The Himalayas are, in geological terms, an almost embarrassingly young mountain range still very much in progress. The Rockies work similarly. The Alps are a version of the same basic process applied to a different set of plates at a different time. Mountain building, geologists call it orogeny, which sounds like a word invented specifically to make geology students nervous, is fundamentally a story of collision, compression, and uplift. Crust gets pushed together, thickens, and rises. The higher it rises, the more aggressively erosion attacks it from above. Rain, ice, wind, and time work constantly downward against whatever tectonics has pushed upward, and the mountain exists as long as the uplift is winning. The moment the collision stops, the outcome is inevitable. Erosion does not stop. Erosion is extraordinarily patient in a way that nothing biological can quite match, and it will work on a mountain range for as long as the mountain range exists, stripping it back centimeter by centimeter, millennium by millennium, until what remains at the surface is not the dramatic peak that once stood there, but the compressed, metamorphosed root that was buried deepest of all, the part of the original mountain that was so far underground, it was actually protected from erosion by everything above it. That is what an Australian mountain is. Not the dramatic peak, the root, the deeply buried, ancient, compressed foundation of something that once stood above it and has since been completely removed by time. When you stand at the base of the Flinders Ranges in South Australia and look up at what appears to be a modest, rust-coloured ridge, you are not looking at a mountain. You are looking at what remains after the mountain was torn down, and the mountain that was torn down was almost incomprehensibly larger than anything currently standing above you. The ranges that shouldn't exist, the Flinders Ranges, are approximately 540 million years old. Let that number sit for a moment because it tends to slide past without registering properly. 540 million years ago, complex animal life had only just appeared on Earth. The first fish were still hundreds of millions of years away. Every living thing on the planet at that point was either microbial or something small, soft and strange, living in shallow Cambrian seas, and the rocks that form the Flinders Ranges were already being compressed, folded, and pushed upward into what geologists now describe as one of the most significant mountain building events in Australian geological history. The McDonnell Ranges in the Northern Territory are older still, cutting east-west across the centre of the continent in a series of parallel ridges that look, from the air, like the fossilised ripples of an ancient wave frozen in rock. These ranges contain some of the most heavily deformed and metamorphosed rock anywhere on the Australian continent. geologists studying the McDonald's have established that the rocks themselves formed somewhere around 800 million to 1 billion years ago, compressed by a mountain building event of a scale that is now almost impossible to reconstruct with confidence because so much of the evidence has been eroded away. The Hamersley Range operates on a timescale entirely its own. The banded iron formations that make up much of the Pilbara are approximately 2.5 billion years old, placing them squarely in the Archean Eon, a period of Earth's history so remote that the planet at that point still had very little free oxygen in its atmosphere. The rocks of the Hamersley were forming at the bottom of ancient seas when the air itself was chemically different from anything breathing it today. That fact alone is worth pausing on. The landscape you can drive through in a hire car in northwest Western Australia is made of rock that formed before oxygen was a significant component of the atmosphere. There is something almost rude about how little attention this gets. What all three of these ranges share, beyond their extraordinary age, is that they are not the original mountains. They are what is left after the original mountains were removed. Geologists working on the Flinders Ranges have calculated that the mountain chain which produced the rocks now visible at the surface would have stood somewhere between 2 and 3 kilometres higher than anything currently there. The McDonald's were likely higher still. The original Pilbara Highland may have reached elevations comparable to the modern Rockies before erosion reduced it to the low ancient plateau visible today. The stone you can touch with your hand in any of these ranges spent much of its history buried underneath something else entirely. It is only at the surface now because everything above it was destroyed. The Ghosts of Gondwana, Australia, was not always a flat, sun-hammered island continent drifting quietly toward Southeast Asia. At various points in deep geological time, this landmass was part of something considerably grander and considerably more dramatic. Gondwana, the ancient supercontinent that contained what would eventually become Australia, Antarctica, South America, Africa, and India, was not a featureless plain. It had mountain chains. Several of them were enormous by any standard you care to apply. One of the most significant of these was the chain geologists sometimes call the Paterman orogeny, a mountain building event centered on what is now Central Australia that occurred roughly 550 million years ago. The mountains this event produced are estimated to have reached heights comparable to the modern Andes. They stretched across a significant portion of the interior of what would eventually become the Australian continent, and they dominated the landscape so completely that their erosion products, the sediment washed off their slopes over hundreds of millions of years, eventually buried the surrounding lowlands in layers of rock kilometers thick. Those mountains are completely gone now, not damaged, not reduced, not merely worn down to comfortable hills. Gone in the sense that the summits, the upper slopes, the mid-elevation flanks and most of the lower reaches have been removed entirely from the geological record. What remains, preserved only because it was buried deeply enough to be protected, is scattered across the center of the continent in fragments. Uluru is one fragment. Kata is another. The ranges of the western desert are others. The breakup of Gondwana added another layer of complexity to this story. Beginning around 180 million years ago, the supercontinent began splitting apart along fault lines that had been building for millions of years. Australia separated from Antarctica last, a process that was not complete until roughly 35 million years ago, and as it separated, it began its long drift northward that continues today. That separation and drift isolated Australia from the tectonic forces that continued building and rebuilding mountain chains on every other separating fragment of Gondwana. The Andes continued rising. The African rift continued opening. Antarctica kept its ice and its geological activity. Australia drifted into geological quietude. No new significant mountain building events. No major collisions, just the continent, the relentless sun, and erosion working on whatever remained of the ranges that had already been partially dismantled before the separation even began. The result is the landscape Australians now regard as simply the way their country looks, without fully registering that it is one of the most heavily eroded surfaces on the entire planet, and that the flatness itself is the evidence. Uluru and Kata are not what you think. Everyone knows what Uluru looks like from a photograph. Rising from the flat red plain, it appears to be something pushed up, extruded from below, a dome of sandstone assembled by some process that left it standing alone in the desert. The actual geological story is almost exactly the opposite, and it is considerably stranger than the version most visitors absorb from a tourist brochure. Uluru is made of arkose, a coarse-grained sandstone rich in feldspar, formed from sediment that washed off the flanks of the ancient Pateman mountain chain somewhere around 550 million years ago. That sediment accumulated in a basin at the mountain's feet, was buried under enormous pressure, compressed into rock, and then tilted by subsequent geological events until its bedding planes, the layers in which it originally formed, now run almost completely vertical. When you look at the surface of Uluru and notice the parallel grooves and lines running up and over its flanks, you are looking at sedimentary layers that were originally horizontal, lying flat on the floor of an ancient basin, subsequently rotated nearly 90 degrees by the forces of a mountain building event that occurred long after the rock itself formed. Kata Tjuta, the collection of rounded domes sitting roughly 30 kilometers to the west, tells a related but different story. Made of a coarser conglomerate, essentially a compressed gravel containing fragments of rock from multiple different sources, Kata Tjuta formed from sediment shed off an even older mountain range than the one that produced Uluru. The fragments locked inside the conglomerate at Kata Tjuta include pebbles and boulders of granite, quartzite, and basalt sourced from mountains that were already ancient when Gondwana was still intact. Here is the detail that most people never hear. Both Uluru and Kata Tjuta are not simply rocks sitting on a plain, they extend underground. Uluru continues below the surface for an estimated 2.5 kilometers. What you see above the ground, the part that appears in every photograph, every painting, every tourism campaign ever produced, is a small fraction of the total structure. The rest is buried. And what surrounds them at surface level, the flat red plain that seems so obviously the natural ground level, is not bedrock, it is erosion debris. Erosion, the remains of the mountains that once stood above these formations, ground down to sand and gravel, and deposited across the surrounding landscape over hundreds of millions of years. Uluru and Kata Tjuta are not standing above the plain. The plain is built from the ruins of everything that used to stand above them. The Cradle Mountain Puzzle. Tasmania sits far enough south that geology gets serious here. Glaciers worked on it during the last ice age in ways that left permanent marks on the landscape. Gouged valleys, polished rock faces, lake basins scraped clean by ice sheets that have since retreated entirely. Rainfall is a genuine presence rather than an occasional visitor. And rising above the central plateau, in a landscape that sometimes looks more like Iceland than anything most Australians would recognise as their own country, the dolerite columns of the Central Highlands reach upward in formations that seem almost artificially angular, too geometric, too deliberate, the kind of shapes that make people stop walking and stare for a moment longer than they intended. Cradle Mountain is the most photographed of these formations, which is saying something in a country that has never been short of dramatic landscapes to point a camera at, standing above Dove Lake in a jagged silhouette that has appeared on enough calendars and tourism brochures to border on visual cliche, though no poster has ever really done it justice, and any photographer who tells you otherwise is being diplomatically modest about their own limitations. The peak is made of dolerite, a dark, dense volcanic rock that did not erupt onto the surface in the conventional sense. It was pushed slowly upward into the existing crust as magma during the Jurassic period, approximately 180 million years ago, and it never quite made it to the surface at all. It cooled underground, slowly, quietly, in the dark. That slow cooling is exactly what produced the columns. When the Jurassic magma was forced between existing layers of sedimentary stone, it spread horizontally through the crust in sheets geologists call sills, thin horizontal intrusions that ran between the rock layers like filling pushed between pages of a book. As the magma cooled, it contracted. Contracting rock under those specific conditions develops stress fractures in a predictable geometric pattern, cracking into the hexagonal and rectangular columns that now define the dramatic skyline of Tasmania's Central Highlands. The columns exist not because something was built upward, they exist because something shrank inward, and the cracking followed the mathematics of that shrinkage with a precision that still reads as almost deliberate even when you fully understand the mechanism behind it. The sedimentary rock that originally surrounded and covered those dolerite intrusions has, in most places, been completely removed by erosion. Hundreds of millions of years of rain, ice, and wind worked on the softer material and dismantled it. What remains standing is the dolerite itself, harder and more resistant than everything it intruded into, left at the surface only because the geological packaging around it was stripped away first. Every column standing against the Tasmanian sky is a cross-section through the interior of what was once a much thicker, more complex geological structure. The exterior has been removed entirely. What you are looking at when you look at Cradle Mountain is the reinforcing skeleton of a landscape that no longer exists around it. What very few visitors to Cradle Mountain ever hear is that the same dolerite intrusions extend across enormous sections of Antarctica, which sat pressed directly against Tasmania when Gondwana was still a single landmass. The columns rising above Dove Lake and the geology buried beneath the Antarctic ice sheet are not similar formations produced by similar processes in different places. They are the same formation, continuous, unbroken at the time of their creation, now separated by the thousands of kilometers of Southern Ocean that opened between the two landmasses when Gondwana finally split apart and the pieces drifted away from each other. The mountains of Tasmania are the visible edge of a geological event that once connected this island to an entire continent. The rest of that connection is down there somewhere, underneath the ice, waiting for a warming planet to reveal what it has been keeping. That is either a hopeful thought or a concerning one, depending on how you feel about the ice staying where it is. What Aboriginal tradition always knew? The oldest continuous cultures on Earth have been living in this landscape for at least 65,000 years. That figure is not a rough estimate or a comfortable approximation. It is based on direct archaeological evidence from sites including Majid Baby in the Northern Territory, where excavations have produced dated artifacts establishing human presence in Australia at a depth of time that places the first Australians in this landscape during the last ice age, when much of the continent looked significantly different from today. 65,000 years of continuous observation of a landscape is not nothing. It is, in fact, an extraordinary body of accumulated knowledge that researchers are only recently beginning to engage with seriously as a scientific resource, rather than treating it as interesting cultural background material. Across multiple Aboriginal language groups of the Western Desert, stories describe a time when the landscape was dramatically different from today. Mountains that no longer exist appear in dreaming narratives, water in places that are now dry. A country shaped by forces that traditional knowledge identifies as foundational events, events that happened before memory, but that left their mark permanently on the land and on the stories attached to it. Researchers, including those working with the Anangu traditional owners of Uluru, have noted that the dreaming stories associated with the site describe a formative period during which the landscape itself was being constructed or shaped by ancestral beings. The Anangu understanding of Uluru does not separate the rock from its surroundings into foreground and background. The entire landscape is understood as a single continuous system in which Uluru, the surrounding plain, the nearby ranges, and the watercourses connecting them are all expressions of the same ancestral events. The tracks of the Tjuta, the dreaming law, run through the landscape in routes that correspond, in several documented cases, to actual geological and hydrological features that researchers only mapped much later using satellite imaging and ground survey. The Arunti people of the McDonnell Ranges hold stories describing the caterpillar ancestors, the Yeperenye, whose movements and conflicts shaped the landscape of the ranges themselves. The east-west orientation of the McDonnells, the specific location of gaps and gorges through the ridgeline, and the distribution of water sources across the range all appear within these narrative frameworks in ways that encode practical navigational knowledge alongside the spiritual meaning. You cannot separate the two, and researchers who have tried to extract only the navigational data while discarding the spiritual context have consistently found that the knowledge does not transfer cleanly. It was designed to be carried whole. What traditional knowledge understood without benefit of radiometric dating or plate tectonic theory is that this landscape was the product of events of an enormous and foundational scale, that the shapes visible today were not the original shapes, that the country had been something different before it became what it is now. The specific mechanism was understood differently, encoded in the logic of the dreaming rather than the logic of continental geology, but the underlying recognition that the landscape you are standing in is a remnant, a surviving fragment of something much larger that has been torn down over an incomprehensible span of time, is present in both frameworks. Science and traditional knowledge arrived at the same basic truth from completely different starting points. What scientists are still working out. Australia's geology presents several problems that researchers have not yet resolved to their own satisfaction. The continent's ancient core, the cratons, geologists love a word that sounds like it belongs in a superhero film, are among the most stable sections of continental crust anywhere on Earth. The Pilbara Craton and the Yilgarn Craton of Western Australia are fragments of some of the oldest surviving continental crust on the planet, dated in places to more than 4 billion years. This is genuinely startling. The Earth itself is only 4.5 billion years old. Rocks that formed within 500 million years of the planet's formation are sitting at or near the surface in Western Australia, visitable by anyone with a sense of direction and a reliable four-wheel drive. The question researchers continue working on is how? How did rocks this ancient survive? Every geological process operating on the planet's surface, weathering, erosion, subduction, metamorphism, collision, and reworking by subsequent mountain building events, should have destroyed them repeatedly over 4 billion years. On every other continent, rocks of comparable age have been reworked, buried, recycled through the mantle, and replaced. On Australia's ancient cratons, they are simply still there. The leading explanation involves the way Australia's ancient core became stabilised early in its history. The cratons are underlain by an exceptionally thick, cold, and chemically depleted section of the upper mantle called the lithospheric keel, a root of dense, stable material that essentially anchors the crust above it and prevents it from being dragged back down into the mantle by the processes that recycle younger crust elsewhere. It is a remarkably effective geological preservation mechanism. The continent's ancient core has been protected from below, while erosion attacked from above, and the balance between the two has resulted in a landscape that is simultaneously among the most eroded and the most geologically ancient on the surface of any planet in the known solar system. Current research is focusing on several unresolved questions within this framework. The precise mechanism by which the lithospheric keel formed is still debated. The timing of the major erosion events that stripped the ancient mountains from the Australian interior is not fully established in every region, and the extent to which climate, in addition to simple geological time, drove the specific pattern of erosion across the continent is an area of active investigation, with researchers using everything from cosmogenic isotope analysis to satellite-based gravity mapping to reconstruct a landscape that no longer physically exists. The data keeps producing surprises. A study published in the early 2000s using deep seismic reflection profiling across the Flinders Ranges found that the crustal structure beneath the visible surface is dramatically more complex than the surface geology suggested, with buried faults and deformed rock extending to depths that indicate a mountain building event far more extensive than the visible remnants had implied. The mountain that left the Flinders Ranges behind was, by the measurements extracted from that deep structure, substantially larger than even conservative estimates had previously suggested. Every time researchers look more carefully at what lies beneath the Australian surface, the original mountains get bigger in the reconstruction. Why? This changes everything. Standing on the summit of Mount Kosciuszko. On a clear day, the view extends across rolling high country that is undeniably beautiful in the way that large, open landscapes have always been beautiful to humans who spend most of their time inside smaller spaces. At 2,228 metres, it is the highest point on the Australian continent, which is a fact that gets repeated often enough that it has stopped registering as genuinely interesting to most people. Here is the version of that fact that should register as interesting. Mount Kosciuszko's current elevation of 2,228 metres represents the leftover fragment of a mountain system that geologists estimate once stood somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 metres above sea level. The summit you are standing on was not in any meaningful geological sense near the top of the original mountain. It was somewhere in the middle, possibly in the lower middle. Everything above the point where you are currently standing, the entire upper section of what was once a significant Himalayan scale mountain chain, has been removed, ground down, washed into ancient seas, deposited as sediment in basins that have since been buried, reworked, or themselves eroded away. The Australian continent is not a place where mountains failed to form. It is a place where mountains formed repeatedly, magnificently, and over such an enormous span of time that erosion was eventually able to finish what it started. The ranges that remain are not the mountains, they are the memory of the mountains, the surviving record of events so old that the rest of the evidence is gone. This is the frame that changes how the landscape reads. Every rust-red ridge in the Flinders, every ancient fractured face of the MacDonalds, every dolerite column standing in the Tasmanian wind, every smooth grooved flank of Uluru catching the late afternoon light in a way that makes people reach for their cameras without quite understanding why it seems so much more significant than a rock ought to seem. These are all the same thing: remnants. Survivors, the compressed, buried, protected roots of something that once dominated the skyline and has since been patiently, completely, relentlessly dismantled by time. The Aboriginal custodians who have lived alongside these formations for 65,000 years or more always understood them as records, as evidence of foundational events that shaped everything that came after. The dreaming did not treat the landscape as scenery, it treated it as a document, a record written in stone of what happened here before any living person was present to witness it, and requiring both deep knowledge and genuine respect to read correctly. The scientists working with seismic profilers and isotope ratios and satellite gravity sensors are reading the same document now, using different tools, arriving at descriptions that use different language, but reaching, with increasing consistency, the same basic conclusion that traditional knowledge encoded long before the instruments existed to confirm it Australia's mountains are not mountains. They are what remains after something much larger was torn down. They are the deepest roots of a lost world, preserved by a combination of geological luck, extraordinary antiquity, and a stable continental core that has protected them from below while time removed everything above. And they have been patiently waiting for someone to look at them correctly. That someone, it turns out, was here all along.